Hi, I want to talk a little bit about using Maven tools to find vulnerabilities in your Java code and how to remediate them using dependency management within Maven. What I have here, not really important what the app is. It happens to be a Spring Boot Hello World program. Really not much to it. Just if you go ahead and hit the web app, once you start it up, it's going to return Hello World, the current time is. And I'm not even going to play with the source code at all, right? What I want to do is look at the dependencies and try to figure out, do we have vulnerabilities? And if so, what are they? So the first thing I'm going to do is actually build the code using Maven. I'm just going to do a clean install. That's going to make sure it downloads everything it needs, all the dependencies, and is able to build it. It's going to take a few seconds to build. And it's going to be completely uneventful. Right? There's nothing to this. It's a very simple app. But what's happening is I happen to know that this is using some older dependencies that have vulnerabilities in them. And I want to avoid shipping this with those vulnerabilities into it. So I need to find the vulnerabilities, and then I need to take care of them, remediate them. So let's let it finish building here. It's almost done. And then let's see if we can find any vulnerabilities. Well, the first step in finding the vulnerability is going to be knowing what's in our build, right? It's almost done here. All right. Go ahead and jar it up. Packaged and done. Okay, so it's all built. So let's see what's in here. I can use a command that's a built-in Maven plugin called Maven Dependency-Tree. Make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. And what this is going to go do is look through our POM, right, the object model, and find what dependencies we're relying on and what dependencies those dependencies are relying on. So the direct dependencies and what they call the transit dependencies of our dependencies, right? So it does this little ASCII arc tree here, right? And this is the starting, this is what I'm building, and you can see it depends on this Spring Framework boot, Spring Boot starter web, right? And the version, and that in turn depends on everything down this line here. And you can kind of see as indents what's depending on what. Right, and this tells us what versions we're using, but it doesn't tell us if any of them are vulnerable. So we're going to come back to this in a few minutes, but let's go ahead and shrink this back up. And what I want to do is add a plugin. And I have here, you can see how simple this POM is, by the way, right? It's just a couple of dependencies, one test dependency, two regular dependencies, and everything else that comes in. And of course, that's one of the reasons you use something like Maven is because it pulls in all those transit dependencies. But I'm going to add in a plugin here. Let me go ahead and grab it so I don't need to retype the whole thing. And that is called OWASP Dependency-Check. And OWASP Dependency-Check is going to look at our POM. Let me fix the indenting here so it's not offensive. There we go. And just by including this as a plugin, it's org OWASP Dependency-Check Maven, and this is the latest version. We'll even talk about how to find that in just a minute. I put that in. Now I have the ability to do a Maven dependency check. And what that is going to do is it's going to go through my POM and it's going to match up the artifacts that I'm including, the dependencies and the transitive dependencies, and it's going to turn those into a database lookup that it's going to find, lists of known vulnerabilities and see if it finds any matches. Now, I've done this a number of times today, so it's already has the database, but if you haven't run this ever before, it may take 10, 15 minutes to download the initial set of vulnerability databases. And actually, if you run it once every 7 days, it will make sure not to download the whole thing, but only some the differences. And you can see it says, hey, one or more of the dependencies are identified with known vulnerabilities, right? And this is them here. That's a little bit hard to read. It turns out it also generates a report here in target dependency check report that I can bring over from here so we can see it. And you can see it a little bit easier to read. And it comes with a lot more information here, right? It does its best guess to match, so there's some evidence as to why it thinks it's a match. Tells you what the identifiers are, looks at the vulnerabilities that are published, right? And we can go ahead, there's a lot of things we can do here to manage it. But basically I can see I have a bunch of vulnerabilities. Now, it turns out in this case that I happen to know for a fact that I'm just using an old version of Spring Boot. So I could just simply update the parent I'm using. That'll bring in everything, and I can go ahead and I can recompile. I'm going to do a clean install, and then I'm going to do this dependency check again at the end, and we'll have it pulled down the 2.6.6 version, which is brand new. Should clean stuff up. Let's let it go ahead and build and do that. Now, I happen to know it's there, and we're going to go back to the older version in just a second after we see what this cleans up and talk about how we could handle it if we didn't know, or if there wasn't a new version out there, right? How we could pick up specific findings and vulnerabilities and address those using dependency management. So let's let this finish compiling. Just finishing up the tests. All right, it's going to finish repackaging, and then it's going to run our dependency check again. Now that dependency check, OWASP Dependency-Check, it's open source software. There's a lot of other versions of what they call SCA software, or software composition analysis software. There's commercial versions. There's even some other OWASP projects that handle it. But if I go ahead and look at this now, this one happens to be an easy one to run. And I look now, I see that there's, hey, nothing found, right? It cleaned up all those dependencies. So simply updating it is almost always going to be your best answer on these things. But let's say we didn't have that. Let's say that wasn't an option. I'm going to go back, put that into place, and go back to the old build. And what's happening? Let's see if I can go back to the old one. Nope. Yeah, I need to wait for it to recompile. So while it's going through, this tool is OS Dependency Check is really good for running in a pipeline, but it's only going to tell us about dependencies it finds at build time while we're actively developing. What it won't tell us is after we push this out to production, did we find something, one of these dependencies was found to have a vulnerability and we're using it, but since we're not building anymore right now, we're not going to notice it. And for that, a good tool to use might be OWASP Dependency Track, where it keeps a track of what the last thing that you built was in each application, what dependencies it had. And for that, we can go ahead and use OS Dependency Track, and it will identify, hey, the new vulnerability was found last time you built, you had that vulnerability in your code, so you should go ahead and fix it. But OS Dependency Check is a really good one for an individual or a small team that's constantly doing development. All right, so this build is done. Let's go ahead, let's look at the report again. I'm going to update it. Oops, still building it. Sorry, jumped the gun a little. There we go. Now it's written out the report. Okay, and these were the problems we found earlier. So let's say I wanted to fix these two problems here. Jackson data bind, right, has known vulnerabilities, and logback core has known vulnerabilities. So how would we go about that? Well, let's start by seeing those again. Let's look at the dependency tree. And when I look at the dependency tree, I can actually see what pieces those are using. So Jackson right here at the top, I can look through, scroll down, and I see right here that Jackson data bind 2.12.5, that was the one that reported vulnerable. It has a couple other pieces that obviously go with it, all within this Spring Boot starter JSON, right? And they're all using this 2.12.5. So one thing I could do is just upgrade Jackson data bind because none of the rest of these were reported as having problems, but they probably all go together, right? And notice the same names. They probably all work together, and if I just change one, the others might not work with it, but I could change all of these at the same time, right? And likewise, I see with this logback, there's a pair there using 1.26. That was another one that had a problem, logback core, but Classic probably wants to go with it as well, right? And in fact, I didn't see any report on this, but Log4j, some of the Log4j stuff, although we're not pulling in Log4j core, but we have a policy we don't use anything that's Log4j that's 2.14. We need 2.17.2. So I can go ahead and update those, even though these aren't actually vulnerable because it doesn't actually have the Log4j core here. So how would I know what to upgrade to? Well, there's another command I can use. And that command is Maven versions display dependency updates. And I happen to know this list is going to be really long, so I'm going to pipe it through less. And what this is going to do is look through the list of the dependencies we have and compare it to the latest versions that are available on Maven Central or in our repos. So when it does this, we're going to get a really long list, and it tells us, hey, there's an alpha version that's newer of our logback stuff. Well, that doesn't really help me a whole lot there, right? It does tell me that Jackson data bind, we were on 2.12.5, and there's these 2.13.2s, and in fact, a 2.13.2.2 for data bind itself. Look all this way down, right? So that's somewhat helpful. I don't often run it this way, although you can see, here are all the things I could update. Now, it turns out, again, if I go to the new if I go to the new Spring Boot, it takes care of a lot of that. But the way I normally do it is I'll go into mavenrepository.com, a little bit bigger, easier to read, and I can plug in, let's take the Jackson data bind here, and I can go ahead and I can do a search. Find this is the right one, the right coordinates. I look in here and I can see that, hey, 2.13.2 has a vulnerability. It actually tells me in Maven repository. It doesn't always, but I can see that there's a newer version here, 2.13.2.2, right? So I know that's the latest version, right? And I could do this for each of those tools and go down and find them. But that's still not really telling me what I needed to know, because now I need to know like what goes with it and all that. And I'm not controlling those. I'm not pulling them in. If we look while this is running, if we go into the POM, I'm not bringing in the Jackson data bind at all, right? It's coming in from these. Well, it turns out that although we generally treat Maven as a build system, it's really a dependency management system, right? And so let's take a quick look here at what is bringing it in, right? It's this Spring Boot Starter. I know there's a newer version, but let's say there wasn't. Let's pretend there wasn't. I could add a dependency management section, right? And this will just tell Maven, hey, I'm not telling you to pull in any of these dependencies, but if you do pull in any dependencies that meet these coordinates, I want you to make sure you always use the versions I tell you, right? And so the first one, right, it's just like the dependency section. The first one is group. It's just dependency group ID, artifact ID, and version, right? The GAV, right? And we saw that 2.13.2.2 was the right version of this. And if I was to go through all these other versions here, oops, too far. All these other Jackson ones down to module parameter names that we're all using that same version, I could go ahead and get the latest version of each of those. But it turns out I've already done it, so I'm just going to paste them in. It turns out there is a 2.13.2.2 of Jackson data bind, but not of all these other ones. They're all going to use 2.13.2, right? And then let's say I wanted to do the log back. You can put this in here too. The latest version of that is 1.2.11. There's actually a newer version like we saw that was an alpha, but this is the latest release version. And then log4j 2.17.2, right? And just by putting those in there, it's not going to include those dependencies, but it says if those dependencies get included, whether it's a transitive or direct dependency, I want you to use these versions. That's what makes it the dependency management version. So, so all I did was add these in here. I didn't do anything to change the dependencies we actually have. And this would carry down if this was a multi-module build. So let's go ahead and let's do a dependency tree again. And while that comes up, we'll see the right versions being used. Back here at the top, I know this is scrolling quick, but if we look here, log back, we were on 1.2.6, which had a vulnerability. This 2.14.1, and then the data bind stuff was all in here. And that was the, ooh, missed a couple here. Did I copy all of them? It was saying 2.12.5, and I was supposed to be using 2.13.2. Let's double check. And make a mistake, 2.13.2. Just trying to get it on my screen here. 13.2, so it got included. It says it's pulling the wrong one. Let's go ahead and do a Maven build and check, make sure everything works. Because just because we updated it doesn't mean it does still build. All right, we've updated versions, but if we go far enough, we might break things because the major version, even some minor version changes, might break it. Looks like it's compiling all right. Let's see if the test pass. All right. Okay, so everything passed. It was able to repackage it. Let's go ahead and run our dependency check again. And see if it finds any vulnerabilities. We specifically addressed the Jackson data bind and the logback vulnerabilities that it had found earlier. So hopefully it fixes those. Almost done here. Okay. And if I bring in the report, we can see that those were indeed fixed. So that's it. Using dependency management, I was able to fix them. We need a little bit more research to figure out why it pulled in older versions of those of the particular tools I had earlier that I said I'd fix. Right? It looked like this Jackson data type. I'm saying in the dependency management section to pull in 2.13.2, and it was pulling in an older version for some reason. So maybe there's somewhere else that's overriding that. I need a little bit more research, but nothing else. We did fix the vulnerability. And in this case, like I said, the actual fix would probably be to just go ahead and upgrade to the latest Spring Boot. There's more you could do here. We could parameterize these. We could make these properties that could all go in the properties section to make it easier to update in one spot. This difference between these two makes that a little bit problematic. So we'd have different settings, but we could figure out a way to do that. But hope this was helpful. Thanks a lot.